Can you prevent a war? Apprehend the apocalypse? I have some big news about an upcoming Kickstarter from QuestNest for their new adventure path, The Divine Forge. The characters will apprehend a war, a blood ritual, orchestrate the escape of prisoners, all to foil the machinations of an evil dragon intent on acquiring power. The quest concludes as the characters are led to the Divine Forge, where they must face off against a dark force to prevent the sinister plans for the Ether. Click the pinned link in the video description and help this idea get funded this week. Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So we're going to talk about summoning again, but I promise we're going to come up with some new stuff here. Patreon ad time. If you would be interested in supporting this channel, please do so through Patreon. You'll find a link to my Patreon page in the video description. My patrons already saw this video and without YouTube ads. And depending on your level of support, you might be a member of my exclusive Discord community, or you might get a video call out, just like this. So thank you to Kurt G, Lee LeMay, LaFurja, IGW, Marlon Rooks, Math Guy Dave, Nathaniel McCauley, Nick Lutz, Nick Simmons, PCZ, Pedro de Vaca, Prometheo NTG, Ramen Goblin, Rohit, Rysquy, Sajin Abraham, Sam S, Scott Dunnington, Scott Shields, Stephen Edmondson, and TUM. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. Listen, I like the idea of a summoner, but playing a summoner has some challenges. The first issue is that summoning spells aren't created equal. We see spells like Conjure Animals right here. I think optimally we would probably agree this spell is perhaps the most potent for its level in the game. You can summon 8 creatures at once, and those 8 creatures may even have multiple attacks each. Then if we upcast this by a couple levels, we can now summon 16 creatures, maybe 32 attacks. Add in 6 levels of Shepherd Druid and we can make all those attacks magical. There's some downsides to a Shepherd Druid build, though, that I would like to cover. Let's say we do summon 16 1/4 challenge rating creatures. Well, are we running this spell as it's written and clarified by the designers? Because in that case, the DM is choosing the creature we summon. So maybe we get 16 tiny but deadly velociraptors, and maybe we get 16 large-sized giant snails. And where am I even putting them? Like, how are they going to get into position? But, okay. Let's say the DM decides to be nice and let us pick. Are we running the rest of the spell as it's written? Because if so, now we need to roll initiative for those new added creatures. So let's say we get our 16 tiny but deadly velociraptors. Okay, so here we are on initiative 14. We do our summon, and now we roll initiative for the raptors, and they're going to go on initiative 15. So now we have 16 creatures with 10 hit points each, and our enemies have an entire round to deal with the issue, which there are so many ways they might decimate a lot of them. Like maybe if we're fighting a dragon and they breathe a cone on the party, that will also wipe all the velociraptors off the map before they do anything. Or, and I experienced this in my one-shot with the Dungeon Dudes in D4 Deep Dive, maybe a storm giant wipes them all out with a lightning strike. Maybe a wall of fire, or a fireball, or any other of nearly countless features that various monsters have that could deal with this threat without really worrying. Or here's one that's not unlikely at all. Maybe they can fly. So now we're concentrating on a spell that is doing nothing. And if our DM is not letting us pick our creature, this is debilitating, because then we can't even choose flying creatures. Now maybe your DM has even more house rules in your favor, so maybe now the creatures get to go right after you, and you don't roll initiative at all, plus you get to pick the creature. Well, then, maybe you're fighting creatures like these salamanders. Then every attack you make with those summoned creatures that actually hits does more damage to your summoned creature than they likely did themselves. Then there's the issue of access. So let's say I cast a spell that gives me access to a creature of a certain type and a certain challenge rating. And let's say the DM, for the sake of making things easier, says, you know what, you go ahead and pick the creature. Do we pick from the monster manual? How about other source books? What about adventures? What about creatures that were clearly designed for a specific unique encounter? Can we summon those? The more investigating we do into all our possible options, the more potential problems we end up with. And every time there is a new published adventure, there's more possible interactions that make these spells work very differently than the designers possibly could have foreseen. This is one of the problems with spells and features where the mechanics involve picking a creature from books and sources that actually it's debatable if players should even be looking at in the first place. And that's just the tactical stuff. What about the question of being table friendly? When I played a Shepherd Druid in that one shot, I made a point of showing that if you prepare beforehand and really focus on taking your turns quickly, then you can. But I've run games since then, many of them, where this spell still significantly slows down gameplay. Just because it can be run efficiently doesn't always mean it is. So as I mentioned, I played a Shepherd Druid in a one-shot on this channel. It was played with the Dungeon Dudes and Colby from D4 Deep Dive, and I played a Shepherd Druid summoner that used Conjure Animals. Now, we talked beforehand because we knew that this could be a disruptive spell. How are we going to make it non-disruptive? So the first thing that Monty, who was the DM, said that, we're going to go ahead and let you pick the creatures beforehand. Because if you throw an unfamiliar stat block at somebody, and then right in the middle of combat, they suddenly have to run multiple creatures with this unfamiliar stat block, then you are definitely going to bog things down. So he went ahead and made that ruling. Now, Sage Advice says that's not the way it runs, but he felt that this was just really important to keep things moving. And the second thing he said was that, we're going to have those creatures take their turn immediately after yours. Again, this was about smoothing out gameplay. If you break up somebody's turn, so now they're going to take their turn, and then a few segments later, suddenly they've got a bunch of creatures to run, plus you have to roll initiative for them, place them on initiative, reorder everything. That can slow things down as well. And he thought it can just make things smoother if we have them go right after you. So I took advantage of all of that, and then we played the game, and it did run smoothly. However, those two rulings had significant consequences. And after that video, Colby actually made an observation here that I thought was really astute. I'm going to play it for you.
More than anything, what I think round one in particular really showed off was why so many DMs don't allow their players to choose the beasts that get summoned by Conjure Animals. Because it can be arguably a little overpowered. And I don't fault Chris, by the way, at all for doing it. I mean, it's a good thing that he did, because had he not, I'm sure we would have TPK'd on that first round. Not that there aren't ways to counter it. Obviously, the AoE damage from the Storm Giants was cool. I loved Monty's little trick of just lightning striking himself, essentially, to get rid of all those raptors. But even just with one round, they did great work, right? With Chris being able to just kind of hide himself and stay safe essentially the whole time.
So what Colby is pointing out here is that if we do make a ruling in the player's favor, in order to allow them to choose their creature, you can potentially end up with an overpowered spell. Furthermore, if you throw more house rules on top, allowing the creature to go right after the character's initiative, then that also makes things more powerful, and we have a spell that was already really powerful. Now, as a DM, you can run it just militantly as it's written. So the creature's not going to go on the initiative right after yours, and you're going to go ahead and pick a creature, and you might even pick a creature that you know isn't going to be overpowered. However, that creates other consequences, because then you really are going to slow down gameplay for multiple reasons. So what you end up doing when you bring this spell to your table is you create a problem for your DM, and it's ironic that in this situation, Colby was actually playing a character called the Catch-22, and what he's describing is a Catch-22 that you create for your DM. And so when I call a spell like this not being table-friendly, this is what I mean. It is not good for your table, even though it is really powerful. There is a point where we have to balance taking the best options for mechanics and taking the best options for everybody. And the more I play with it, the less I think that Conjure Animals fills those requirements. So I've mentioned how I think these spells that conjure lots of creatures and or have you roll separate initiatives for these creatures aren't really table friendly, and they kind of force the DM to make rulings in your favor, which also makes these spells more powerful than they were intended to be in order to run things smoothly. And what's happened is a lot of tables have soured on the idea of summoning altogether. And this is such a sad thing because, in theory, summoning should be interesting. There should be so many different concepts we could put around summoning, but that's another problem. We don't. We have one concept that just comes over and over again. I have literally given up hope as a DM that when a player comes to me and says, I am playing a summoner, that it's going to be anything except for a shepherd druid, and they're going to use conjure animals and conjure woodland beings. Maybe they'll do a conjure elemental. And it's just these same characters over and over again doing the same things. There is no originality in this character. This character is done to death. You are beating a dead horse. If you want to actually make interesting characters that use summoning, you would have to do something else. And that makes me wonder, is this what we're stuck with? Are we stuck with, if we want to play a summoner, we have no choice for concept beyond shepherd druid and all the usual suspects, and any other summoning concept just isn't going to be effective? Because if that is the case, then frankly, I'm done playing summoners. But I do want to actually explore, are there other ways we can actually be effective with summoning in a table-friendly way with concepts that don't all fit these same cookie-cutter characters that we've seen played so many times? Because it's not like there's not interesting summoning spells that are table-friendly. The designers of this game have started to design summoning spells that work very differently since Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, in order, I presume, to make them run more smoothly at your table without requiring for you to ask for house rules in your favor so that they're less disruptive. If you look at these kinds of summoning spells, they all start with the word summon, and they'll be in source books anytime from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything or later. I assume any additional summoning spells they create will be following these design metrics, and I would put money that when we see the next player's handbook, the new versions of summoning spells are going to look a lot more like these than their original design. So let's look at how these spells are designed. Well, first of all, they all summon a single creature. So we no longer need to worry about how multiple creatures completing turns for each round can impact the game. Second, the summoned creature takes its turn immediately after yours, so your DM doesn't have to create a house rule for that either. Thirdly, when we cast these spells with a higher level slot, the improvements affect that single creature, so we are keeping things under control. And finally, and this is really important, we get some choices regarding the creature we summon, but it's all restricted to the options within the spell description and the creature template provided. So when I cast Summon Beast, I can choose an air beast, a land beast, or a water beast, and this not only affects movement types, but as well other features. But in any of those cases, the differences are constrained to what is available within the spell description. These spells are entirely self-contained, and that makes all these spells significantly more table-friendly. So why aren't players just taking these spells instead of the ones that have all the problems that we've talked about? Well, I think there's a couple reasons for that. The first is that when you look at the hit points of these creatures, they kind of seem low from my gut instincts, because I look at, say, Conjure Elemental, and then I look at these spells, and they have significantly lower hit points. Are they even enough hit points that they're not just going to die on me? The second problem is, what am I going to get from them? Are they going to do enough damage? I mean, damage is mainly what we're going to expect from these spells. Is it worth my spell slot and my concentration to do damage through this spell when I know how much damage Conjure Animals does? I think we need to actually look at it. We need to do some analysis to determine, is this even worthwhile? Because if it's not worthwhile, then summoning, as far as I'm concerned, is a dying thing in Dungeons & Dragons, because we are stuck with one single concept, and that concept is not table-friendly. So our analysis needs to include, number one, are these summoning spells durable enough? Number two, are they going to deliver enough damage? How reliable is that damage going to be? How well do they scale if we cast them at a higher level? Because remember, these spells are kind of built for internal scaling. There's no, summon Greater Beast. You summon Beast and then you upcast it. Is that even good enough? We need to do some math to determine if that is the case, because If we're going to make characters that are focused summoners, we would probably expect them to be full spellcasters, but we should be able to take a look at snapshots of different levels and determine, is it effective at this level? Is it effective at this higher level? Is it effective at even this higher level? And it should be effective from the moment we start summoning to the end of the campaign, even if that campaign ends at level 20. And if it's not viable for that period of time, then maybe these aren't viable concepts at all. But if they are viable, then we really should look at what kind of subclasses we can use to enhance these options. What kind of feats could we take? What kind of spells could we take? But before we do that initial calculation, there's no point in us doing that. Another thing I should mention is these spells cover levels 2 through 6, so if we are talking about a character that is going to focus on summoning, we probably don't want to start with a 6th level spell, or even a 5th level spell. We want to be able to start with summoning spells that are 2nd or 3rd level, and then maybe move up to those higher level spells later on. So those low level spells need to be effective in themselves. So first, let's look at damage. Now keep in mind, I'm not considering reliability of that damage at this starting point, but we do need to look at it later. Let's just run the flat numbers though, because if these spells can't deliver decent damage, we're probably done before we go any further. So in combat, our summon creature is using our concentration, but none of our actions. So let's just say, we throw cantrip with our action. Let's see what kind of damage we would do. I guess we'll assume maybe, a D8 scaling damage for a cantrip. That covers a lot of them. Obviously, it's possible to do more damage than that. Particularly with Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast. But let's stick with the D8 scaling for now. So I have a baseline for damage. These numbers are based on a Warlock that uses Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast and concentrates on Hex for an additional D6 damage per blast. I assume the Warlock starts with a 16 Charisma and increases it at levels 4 and 8. I assume a 60% chance to hit based on the scaling that you see here. This damage I consider to be okay. If we can't match this damage, then the damage we're delivering isn't very good. It's not uncommon for builds focused on damage to do anywhere from 50% to 100% or even higher than these numbers. Now, as a summoner and a full caster, we're not totally focused on damage, but I would hope we could at least match these numbers. Okay, let's look at maybe Summon Beast. This is our most basic of these summoning spells. Now, if we make a land beast, we get Pack Tactics, which can give us advantage on these attacks, and I think we're going to ignore that. Most of these summoning spells don't get that option. Let's say we need, a flying beast. So we have to have a flying beast. Well, our damage per attack is going to be a d8 plus 4 plus the spell's level. So we're going to start with a 4th level caster. So I guess, a druid using Produce Flame for a d8 scaling cantrip, that would work. And punching these numbers is going to give us a decent overview for all these kinds of spells, because the damage isn't that much different between the different spells, and it scales very similarly regardless of which spell we're using. But this being the most basic spell, I think this is kind of our worst case scenario. So at 4th level, we'll cast this with a 2nd level slot. That's a d8 plus 4 plus 2. And we have a 5% chance of critting, and that would give us an additional d8. So here's how the math shakes out. We got 10.5 base times 60% chance, that's 6.3 damage. 4.5 times 0.05 of a critical, that's 0.23 damage. And then we do our Produce Flame cantrip, that's 4.5 average damage, times 0.65, that's a 60% chance to hit, plus a 5% chance to crit. We can put them all together since it all doubles on a crit, and that equals 2.7. We add that all together, and our DPR at level 4 is 9.23, and our baseline at level 4 is 8.25. So we're actually about 12% over baseline. That's not bad, and it means that, at least at level 4, this is a viable option. Okay, so now let's look at 8th level. Now we're casting with a 4th level slot, so if we look under multi-attack, you'll see we can now attack with our summon creature twice per round. Our Produce Flame now does 2d8 damage as well. So here's the math. 12.5 times 60% equals 7.5 times 2 attacks equals 15. Then 9 extra possible damage on critical hits times 5% equals 0.45. Then our Produce Flame gives us another 5.85. So we'll add that together, and our DPR is 21.3 versus a baseline of 17.7 at 8th level. Now that is interesting, because just by scaling the same second level spell with a higher level slot, we went from 12% over baseline to 20% over baseline. So we're actually looking better now than we did at 4th level. Let's see if that keeps happening. So we'll look at level 12. Now we're casting with a 6th level slot, so we get 3 attacks, and the damage of each attack is scaled a bit as well. So here's the math: 14.5 per attack times 60% chance to hit, 8.7 times 3 attacks equals 26.1. 13.5 potential critical hit damage times 5% equals 0.68. And our produced flame is doing 13.5 times 0.65, or 8.78. Add them together, now our DPR is 35.56. Baseline at this level, 26.55. And you know what? We've jumped again. 12% over to 20% over, and now we're 34% over baseline. Our damage here isn't just scaling, it is scaling at a rate higher than our baseline. That is really good news. Okay, so now let's look at level 16. So we can now cast with an 8th level slot, so 4 attacks and more damage for each of them. You know, baseline doesn't scale between levels 12 and 16, so let's go to 17th level, so baseline will scale again. So now we'll see the concept versus our highest possible baseline. So here we go. 16.5 per attack times 60% to hit equals 9.9 times 4 equals 39.6. And then 18, this is critical hit damage, times 5% equals 0.90. And our produced flame, which is now scaled for the final time, is now doing 18 damage times 65% equals 11.7. Now, if we add that all together, our DPR is 52.2. Baseline at this level is 35.4, and that is the highest our baseline ever gets. We have 35.4 at 17th level, 35.4 at 20th level. So we went from 12% over baseline to 20% over baseline to 34% over baseline, and now to 47% over. Now, I cannot emphasize enough the significance of these numbers, because what we're told online is that these spells fail to deliver the damage they need to play an optimal character. But these numbers do not support that theory. These numbers suggest that we can indeed play an optimal character. The baseline is set specifically so I can determine if a build is doing enough damage. And if damage is part of what your build should do, it definitely must exceed the baseline. These numbers exceed the baseline, and the further up we go, and remember, we're just scaling the second level spell. We're not even upgrading our spell here. But just from the second level spell, no subclass bonuses, we're doing a D8 cantrip unenhanced, and the numbers versus the baseline continually improve as we go up in level. That is super encouraging. Now, we still haven't answered the question of delivering reliable damage, or whether these summons will remain safe or even relatively durable. But if they can, with a duration of 1 hour, even if we're using concentration, playing a full caster, we should be able to have enough spell slots to do lots of other interesting options to complement the damage we're doing. And if we're doing that, then frankly, anything over the baseline is enough for an effective character. So this, on its own, is super encouraging. Which brings us to the elephant in the room, reliability of damage. There's a number of things that can affect the reliability of damage. The damage type, because if you face resistance or even worse, immunity, these numbers are cut in half if you're lucky, and the ability to make the attacks. So is it a problem if creatures are flying? Are at long range? Can we close that range? And finally, if our creature just dies, then it's not doing any damage until we recast. And that's if we have an appropriate level slot available. The least reliable types of damage in the game are non-magical bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. The Shepherd Druid is the only subclass in the game that can change these damage types so they're treated as magical, though only for beasts or fae and only for their natural weapons. So I want to start by eliminating some of these spells that just aren't going to work because of that problem. So first, Summon Beast. It can potentially work for a Shepherd Druid, as it would benefit from their 6th level feature. This is the only case where this spell is going to work for reliability of damage. So if we want to focus on this spell, then we pretty much have to be a Shepherd Druid. Now our summoned Fae use a short sword. Now in theory, if you have a magical short sword, you could hand it off to your summoned creature. Make sure to check with your DM, of course, but if you can, then this can work. If not, there's no way to make this attack reliable beyond the 1d6 additional force damage, and I don't need to do any math to tell you it's not enough. One nice thing about this spell is it is available to 3 primary casters: Druids, Warlocks, and Wizards. Summon Construct, unfortunately, I think we just need to eliminate it. Non-magical bludgeoning damage, and no way to make it magical. Elemental Spirit, probably not going to work. Bludgeoning damage for 3 out of 4 of the forms, and fire damage for the final form, which is probably our next worst form of damage. Summon Draconic Spirit does non-magical piercing damage. Yeah, it does get a 2d6 Cone Breath weapon on top of that, but that doesn't scale with our level. Also, since this is a 5th level spell, this is coming on late to kind of focus on. Summon Fiend and Celestial might be okay, but they're also higher level spells. So maybe they're an option for later on, but we aren't casting these until higher levels regardless. If we're focused on summoning, we should at least start with a lower level option. So that leaves us with Summon Beast, and only in the case of the Shepherd Druid, Summon Fae, and only in the case where you can hand them a magical short sword, in which case it could be a Druid, Warlock, or Wizard. Summon Shadow Spawn. Now these do cold damage, which isn't super reliable. I'm looking at 16 pages of creatures with resistance and 6 with immunity. We might use this with a Warlock or Wizard. Summon Undead. These do necrotic damage or non-magical slashing damage. I'm seeing only 7 pages of creatures with resistance and 5 with immunity, so this is a fair bit more reliable than cold damage. Warlocks and Wizards get this spell. Then we have Summon Aberration. These do psychic damage. There's only 3 pages of resistance and 5 with immunity, so a bit more reliable yet. Again, Warlocks and Wizards get this. Also, the Aberrant Mind Sorcerer can get this with psychic spells. Okay, so what ways do we have to increase the chance we can deliver damage in the first place? Well, we have some standouts. The air version of the Summoned Beast can do a flyby attack with a 60-foot fly speed, so they can close a fair bit of distance and potentially fly out of range. Though if they can't, 20 base hit points plus 5 per spell level means even with an 8th level casting, we're only talking about 50 hit points. Summon Fae can potentially move in and then Fae step away again. One big problem here is if we are facing flying creatures, these just don't work. 80 hit points with an 8th level spell slot is a fair bit more durable than Summon Beast. Shadow Spawn as well is not going to work on flying creatures. Look at those hit points though. 110 hit points with an 8th level slot. Being that these creatures are stuck in melee, that is a nice boost of durability. Just for comparison, if you had a 17th level fighter and they had a 16 constitution, they'd have 149 hit points. Now, they would have higher armor class likely, so keep that in mind. Still, these aren't dropping in a single hit or anything. Summon Undead has a nice option of the skeletal form with a 150-foot ranged attack. 70 hit points with an 8th level spell slot for that particular form. Summon Aberration might be our most reliable damage of all. The Beholderkin can fly and hover, and do a 150-foot ranged attack. 80 hit points with an 8th level slot. So let's put some of this information together. So first off, damage. Just from our base damage calculations, we determine that these spells can deliver over the baseline damage right through to level 20. However, we're going to need a reliable damage type. That might require accessing more than one of these spells. The second thing we should note is that although the damage is above the baseline, it's not massively above the baseline. So if we're going to make builds using these spells, we need to either find ways to enhance that damage further, or we need to find other ways to contribute to combat. And some of those ways might be built into these spells themselves, or with other things our character can do. Finally, when it comes to durability, we notice that some of these spells are fairly durable. Summon Shadow Spawn is kind of the standout there. Other ones are far more fragile. Summon Beast is kind of the standout there. But we do have ways that we can reduce the damage we would expect these creatures to take. whether it's flyby attack or ranged attacks. With all that information, the next thing I think we need to look at are ways we might enhance these spells through the rest of our character build. So I'm adding an edit right here because I was doing my video editing where I was going through the spells and subclass features and feats that can enhance focusing on these kind of summoning spells, and I realized I was getting a bit too much into spoiler territory because I need to keep you guys on the hook, so you'll watch the next video, or videos, wink wink. There was one piece of important information in that piece, though, I still want to mention, and that's about scaling these spells up. Since multi-attack scales at every even spell slot level, those are the sweet spots when available. Casting 4th, 6th, or even 8th level summons gets you the biggest bang for your spell slot. But most importantly, here is the fantastic news. Since I have worked out proof of concept and can now show mathematically that builds that use these summon spells are viable, even without all that much customization, that is incredible, because it means that the slate for concepts is clean. We can make flavorful, table-friendly, concept-based builds that still deliver. So here's the question. How many concepts am I excited for besides Druid casting Conjure Animals can I possibly devise? Well, you're about to see. Stay tuned as I provide some builds that deliver on flavor, concept, mechanics, all around these table-friendly summoning spells. I hope you'll be back to check those out. But for now, please share in the comments below your own experiences with these spells or any cool concepts you have going on in your imagination right now. I'll be back soon, but until then, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.